Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Dr. Anita Bhela from the University of Delhi, and today we will be doing the module Literary Criticism in the Modern Age. This module has been prepared by Dr. Jyotsna Pathak, also from the University of Delhi. We will be studying the general trends of literary criticism during the 19th century. The various movements of Positivism, industrial and imperial expansion, as well as other movements of Realism, Symbolism, Naturalism, and the thinking of heterological thinkers. The 19th century was a period when great social and political transformations were taking place. There was the idea of the nation state that was emerging, like that of Italy and Germany. And at the same time, there was a European expansion across the world, which was to alter things all over the world. At the same time, there was the impact of the Industrial Revolution that was taking place alongside. There was a movement of people from the towns to the cities. Means and modes of communication had made it easy to travel and communicate. And the news centers where people were going became the offices in the cities. The village and the church were no longer the center. At the same time, so because of this movement, there developed a new class that was the working class. At the same time, there were tremendous developments in science, and this development of science was challenging traditional belief in religion. People were turning away from religion and moving more towards a commercial culture. Matthew Arnold was later to criticize all the classes that were not concerned at this time about morals, not about the good, but rather were hankering after mammon. The aristocracy, the middle classes, and the lower classes, the populace in general. Something called positivism we can find in this period. It was a conservative reaction to changes taking place. What were its standards? It accepts the world as given, says that the only evidence which could be verified empirically was admissible, and it led to a rejection of all divine and a priori laws of perception. And this took the forms of naturalism and realism. Realism. It was a movement seen in the 1840s in Europe as well as in America. The earlier periods had talked about ideals and the idea of the exaggerated idea of realism was seen in the 1840s in Europe and America, and it was a reaction against perceived idealization and introspection of Romanticism. They rejected the ideas propagated by Romanticism or the ideas of idealism. This realism was reflected in art, Gustav Corbois. He put up an exhibition of his paintings titled Realism, and it was held in 1855. He held this exhibition after his paintings were rejected by the Paris World Fair. The paintings show what we call a slice of life. He depicted scenes of life divorced from all moral, emotional, and aesthetic investment. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood also, through the minute representation of detail, tried to revive moral seriousness and directness in art. At this time, the subsequent development of photography and the idea of photography accuracy further influenced the development of realism in art and literature. The photograph, they felt, captured a slice of life, life as it is. But today that idea is also being questioned. Edmond Duranty said in respect of realism that work should be sincere, truthful, and modern. He suggested that novels should reflect the lives of the working class and the middle class. Champfleury wrote essays on realism, said that a characteristic of realistic writing is a scrupulous documentation free from all moral constraints. Taine said that every work is a function of the race, milieu, and moment in which it was created, and that it is the critic's responsibility to reveal these. Since the text scrupulously reflected the reality of the lived world in which it was created, it revealed the psychology of the writer and of the age. What are the characteristics of realism? Realism attempted an accurate representation of the observed external world and the self. It did not believe in any kind of embellishments. It believed in representing the slice of life. It paid close attention to direct observation, to factuality, to experience and induction, arriving at general truth only on the basis of repeated experience. In realism, there was a preponderance of descriptive and evocative details, and the artist deliberately tried to avoid fantastical and mythical elements. Writers tried to use an extremely simple style. They tried to include in their works the everyday speech and its colloquialisms, the directness and simplicity of expression, and they believed in the conscious rejection of any kind of elevated language. If you remember and go back to Aristotle, you will see that the emphasis was on the grand style, the grand hero, the noble action, not of any everyday character. But the realists rejected all the past doctrines of idealization and romanticism. To continue with the characteristics of realism, it was the realists tried to focus on the here and the now. They tried to fit the characters from all social strata. It was not confined to any particular class. And there was no longing for some ideal utopian world. And since realism focuses attention on the particular, oftentimes the experience is divorced from its immediate surrounding, making it unidimensional. Experiences in realism are seen only in terms of causality, chronology, and definable motive, so that reality becomes a given and an unchangeable. Naturalism was an extreme form of realism. It implies a study of nature. It is often viewed as an extreme form of realism, as I said, and it draws on the principles of causality, determinism, explanation, and experimentation. Trollope, Thackeray, Charles Dickens, and George Eliot were all realists, and their works reflect the social, political, and religious ideas prevailing in 19th century England. They tried to remain as close to reality as possible. They tried to depict life as they saw it. They tried to show the reality to which the world might have closed its eyes. Yet, the doctrine of arts for art's sake was something with which they did have some problems. Flaubert felt that writing needed some kind of art. George Eliot herself, although she kept as close to truth as possible, she did not idealize her characters. Rather, she shattered any ideas her characters might have about themselves. She showed the characters the reality about themselves as well. Yet, she did not want to put life into certain preconceived categories. Although she tried to be realistic in technique, and yet she looked for and found beauty in ordinary things as well. So it was a movement with which some of the practitioners themselves had some problems. Naturalism, again, being an extreme form of realism, rejects romanticism and all types of mysticism. Its founder was Émile Zola, and he insisted that a naturalistic novel should be rooted in actuality. It should be based on an observation of human beings and their passions. There should be nothing extraneous. Characteristics of naturalism. The author alters the conditions and circumstances of the characters created by him to posit causes for their actions. The novel is a tool to conduct an inquiry on man. It draws on Darwin's theory of the struggle for existence. The psychologically and physically determined dimensions of character are overwhelmed by accidental circumstances. So characters are inherently tragic and cannot act rationally, freely, and heroically upon the world. The focus is on the hereditary psychological makeup of character and the relationship between human psychology and external environment, with the rejection of any spiritual perspective. Symbolism was a movement that arose in reaction to realism and naturalism. The symbolist movement started in France, and its chief proponents were Mallarmé and Baudelaire, and they rejected all the tenets of realism and naturalism. They felt that the complexity of experience needed a different form to express itself. And this symbolist movement came to its zenith in the 1890s. It came to England through Arthur Symon's book, The Symbolist Movement. Of course, when symbolism, when it reaches its extreme form, because sometimes the poets, especially the French poets, use symbols which were esoteric and which could not be easily understood. And therefore, it acquired or was considered a decadent movement. But the English poets who adopted symbolism, like W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot, became very successful poets and writers. Yeats approved of symbols, not only which existed according to him in the human consciousness, but also he evolved his own set of symbols which grew over many of the poems in his works. He takes his symbols from mythology, from nature, and from anywhere else that he can. What were the main characteristics of symbolism? Their concern were almost as similar to that of the Romantics. Language, poetic form, human subjectivity, and the evocation of mental states and ideal worlds. They were antagonistic to urban life since it wasn't free and was instead controlled by industry and commerce. They viewed the material world as an imperfect reflection of a higher eternal realm which could be invoked through symbols. They viewed language as a means of viewing reality or experience from one of many viable perspectives. For them, words, their arrangements on the physical page, and their sound were a means of creating meaning. So language itself becomes a means of creating meaning. They did not wish to be hampered by any set forms of poetry. They believed in the free verse. And therefore, they did not use language in a descriptive manner like the realists and the naturalists. They used language in a more suggestive and evocative manner to suggest states of consciousness and experience. They rejected all discursive use of language. They tried to reinvest language with its powers of ambivalence and mystery. Aestheticism was another movement which was the extreme development of symbolism. It adhered to the doctrine of art for art's sake. For the sake of beauty, they rejected all moral, political, and didactic reasons for the creation and consumption of art. They reacted against the bourgeois world of utility and consumption. They were disillusioned with religion and its teachings of salvation, as we see in the works of Walter Pater. There was a rejection of the mainstream bourgeois mechanized world in favor of the exaltation of art and of experience. Since the act of knowing an object involves the experiencing subject, it becomes an extremely subjective experience. Thus, experience is no longer absolute and ceases to be the sine qua non of knowledge. Since experience and knowledge are no longer governed by any essential morality and reason, it ceases to be the basis of any scientific inquiry. The world, therefore, is comprised of the subject's impressions of it, and so always changing and in a state of flux. We know that the symbolists and the aesthetes, they believe that art should have no moral considerations and that it should be appreciated only for beauty. But these views were in conflict with the views of certain other Victorian thinkers who felt that art had a moral influence. And they did not agree with the aesthetes. They rather felt that if art was not ameliorative, then there was no significance to art itself. Oscar Wilde, who was a homosexual, went against the established social norms of the day and against the preconceived views of morality of the middle classes. He also emphasized that art has no moral concerns but that of beauty, and that beauty is of the viewer. Oscar Wilde also broke new ground when he tried to establish the autonomy of criticism in itself. He did not believe that the artist's work was just a spontaneous overflow of feelings, but rather that it was a conscious effort. And that the critic could understand it in a different way. So, besides saying that art should have no moral considerations, he went a step ahead and established the authority of the critic and also of criticism as an art. Let us now study about the heterological thinkers. They are based on a critique of enlightenment, notions of the scientific progress of civilization and of the perfectibility of the individual and state through reason. They lay emphasis on the role of emotions, the body, sexuality, and pragmatic interests. They believe that rational knowledge is insufficient in the perception of ideas. According to them, poetry is the paradigm of disinterested and objective knowledge. Some heterological thinkers, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche. Next we come to the doctrine of Marxism. As we discussed in the beginning, this was a time when great social and political transformations were taking place, and we also studied that alongside there was the Industrial Revolution taking place, which had given rise to the new working class. There was a conflict between the bourgeoisie and the working class. And there were many thinkers who wanted to fight for the interests of the working class. Marxism and the Marxist thinkers, they theorized the materialistic concept of history, which is characterized by the structure and nature of individuals and society is determined by the activity and the conditions of material production. The creation of private property is a consequence of the division of labor. This division of labor leads to class conflicts and conflicts between individual and communal interests. It is their struggle that takes place within societies that finally leads to social change and transformation. Let us see what the Marxist has to say about the status of women. They believe that the exploitation of women is an intrinsic part of capitalist economies and felt that this could only be rectified when both private property and the family as an economic unit are abolished. This is so because in capitalist economies, women as the female sex have been removed from public industry. Today we have studied about literary criticism in the Victorian age. It is a vast subject and needs an in-depth study. However, we will go over some of the salient points. We know that the 19th century was a time of great social, political, and religious transformations. We also know that the Industrial Revolution that had taken place was also bringing about vast changes, as was the European imperialism. During this time, a number of literary movements took place. First, there was this reaction against some of the previous established ideas about what constitutes art. Artists now believed that it was important to reflect life as it really is, without any embellishments and without any idealizations. They wanted art to present a slice of life. The extreme form of the movement of realism resulted in naturalism. But there was a rebellion against both these movements. And we have the movement of symbolism. Realism, the symbolists felt, was not enough to present the complexity of life. There was much more to life than what appeared. And therefore, the symbolists turned away from the ideas of naturalism and realism and substituted it for symbolism in art and language. This was followed by the aesthetes, who believed that art should have no moral, social, political consideration and should be appreciated only for its beauty. The aesthetes were the followers of Aestheticism, which also believed in the same thing, but the aesthetes were more rigid. And then there were other thinkers who came, who expressed their ideas on society, on religion, on God, for more. For further reading, refer to the e-text. Thank you.